spearheading a new civilization, but that corporations, government, and social institutions left over from an era of mass production are not keeping up with this rapidly changing world. Alvin Toffler discusses his book with former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich. As a young assistant professor at West Georgia State College in the early 70s, Newt Gingrich began working with the Tofflers. He often referred to their work during his political career, and even put Toffler books on his required reading list for members of Congress and all Americans.
It's a personal thrill for me to have a chance to spend an hour talking with you, and I think we owe it to our viewers to share a little bit about how long we've known each other. But I want to say, going into this, we're going to talk about Revolutionary Wealth, your new book, your extraordinarily important contribution to thinking about the 21st century. But in my mind and in my lifetime, that book really stands on top of a contribution to thinking around the world. Future Shock in 1970, the Third Wave in 1980, Power Shift in 1990. And I can say personally, both as a college teacher when I first met you, then as a member of Congress, and then as Speaker of the House, that the number of people I know whose lives were changed because in Future Shock you told them the world really was going to change dramatically. In the Third Wave you began to explain how it was going to change. And in Power Shift you set the beginnings of an institutional framing. So I've looked forward as soon as I knew we could do this together, Al, the fact that you and Heidi have now produced Revolutionary Wealth and continued to show people how the 21st century will evolve. But why don't you for a minute first, if we might be personal. I remember having read Future Shock, being very excited, and then as a young teacher at West Georgia College, coming, I believe, to Chicago.
Yes.
And why don't you pick it up from there for a minute?
Well, it was a conference, I believe, of the American Council of Education, and I was going. Future Shock was the bestseller by then, and I was speaking, and you came up to me afterwards, and of course you weren't dressed the way you are dressed now, and your hair was different, and you were wearing different glasses, and you were in the style of the 70s, shall we, 60s and 70s, shall we say, and we met perfunctorily, I thought at first. And then we met again in 1975. We were asked by two Democratic, one senator and one congressman, to stage a meeting on Capitol Hill that would talk to the members of Congress about the future. And so Heidi and I agreed to do that, and we started to organize that, and we made lists of people who would come, and the lists were almost entirely Democrats. And so the question, isn't there a Republican who futurist someplace? Somebody said, well, there's this guy Gingrich in Georgia, and then and we got in touch with you, and you came, and that was a day and a half, I think it was, a day and a half on Capitol Hill, and we brought together members of both parties, and it was a good experience. I'm not sure how much impact it had on the institution at that point. But that's when we first had a substantive
well, but in that context for just a minute, you first of all, for a young assistant professor at West Georgia College in Carrollton, it was a big deal to come to Washington to be part of that kind of group. And I think coming out of that, there was a caucus in the future. The people tend to forget. I mean, both Al Gore and I belonged to it at one point.
People forget that you and Gore both were active in that caucus.
And there was a real effort in the early 80s to think about the future in new and bold and different ways. And I know coming out of that, you had a huge impact on General Starry at the Army Training and Doctrine Command. I think it's fair to say that Japan became different because of your work. China became different. The U.S. Army became different. And when we had a group who were meeting regularly, the Conservative Opportunity Society Republicans, you were very generous and came and talked about the scale of change and talked about the ideas. And I think there was a whole generation of then younger, now not so young, political leaders who found that exciting. But you've gone and continued to build on that work. And I think this is the important thing, is that, first of all, that you have been largely right in general patterns. If anybody goes back and looks at, from Future Shock to the Third Wave to Power Shift, there's a continuity of understanding of the future that is pretty remarkable, and that you are now building on with Revolutionary Wealth. But I think it would be helpful, if you don't mind, not that you're going to give away any trade secrets here, But how did you and Heidi pick up the rhythm of the future in such a profound way and begin to sense that the world was different than people around you thought it was?
I would say that actually began in the late 50s for us, when we were here in Washington and when I was covering the Hill. I somehow knew that there was something called computers out there, that they were just moving from the military and government into businesses, first big gigantic mainframes. And there were other things happening. And we actually wrote an essay called The Subterranean Revolution. And it has remained subterranean.
But can people Google it? I mean, it does exist.
No, it never was published. It was never published.
Really?
And there was a good reason for it. We didn't really have it together. We didn't have the ideas yet well formulated and so forth. But we sensed basically that we're coming into a period of a lot of change, and that most people, and especially the political system, seemed unaware of it. So it was contact with Congress, actually, that probably sparked the first attempt to write this stuff. And then that was late 50s. Wound up after that going to work for Fortune magazine, which introduced us to business. We had previously had experience with unions, trade unions, and then we had a lot of contact with other parts of society and so forth, but we'd had no contact with business. And that happened when I started work at Fortune magazine, and was followed by, as soon as we left, an invitation by IBM to write a report for them on the future social and organizational implications of the computer. And I wrote that. I went out to California. I saw the big mainframes that was first random access computers, met the world's first artificial intelligencers, and was blown away by what I saw. So that was, I didn't learn, by the way, until 35 years later, that was a report for Tom Watson.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I worked through an intermediary, an economist on their IBM staff, and 35 years later he called me and said, of course you know who that was for. I said, of course I don't.
But when you were first doing this in the mid-'60s, there's still not a general popular consensus that we're going to have the wave of change that happened.
Well, another thing that was going on at the same time in our lives, we were writing Future Shock. We said that change was going to accelerate. That was the basic thesis, and that people might have difficulty adapting to change, and organizations would have difficulty adapting to change. And that thesis, I think, is held very clear. There are particular forecasts that we made in the book that have come to be, one or two that have not come to be. And it's interesting, looking back. For example, this was finally published in 1970. We said that there would be cloning, that we would be cloning animals and also humans. We haven't cloned humans yet, but I believe, in fact, that that's going to happen whether we wanted to or not. We made a mistake. We said by 1985. Now, where did we get 1985? How did we cook up that number? The answer is it came to us from one of the world's leading Nobel Prize-winning biologists, who was a bit more optimistic than his fellows. So the overall arguments that we made in Future Shock, I think, have held up, as you suggest, pretty well. And there were individual forecasts. We talked about the coming of cable television at a time when everybody said there'll never be cable because advertisers won't advertise on cable. It's too small. We saw the first, what was called at that time, electronic video recording. And this was all pre the digital stuff. And so we were increasingly aware of the technological changes going on.
Have you always, in that sense, since the 60s, spent a fair amount of time looking at cutting-edge technologies and talking to people who are out actually developing them? I mean, in a sense, do you spend a disproportionate amount of your time with the small and the new rather than the large and the established? Or how do you keep your brain? How do you keep pulling your brain?
I would say that's the case. The only thing that I would modify there is that our interests are increasingly less technological and more social, even than they were in the past. We're not techies. We're not geeks. We are not capable of writing software. We knew that something really important was happening, that this was going to change a lot of things. But now, I believe that while we still face enormous, challenging technological changes coming out of biology, coming out of the convergence of biology and digitalization and space, all of these things coming together are going to create fantastic challenges for us in the years ahead. But in this book, Revolutionary Wealth, we focus more on the social implications of that, and the failure of our institutions over the last 20 or 30 years to come to terms with this transformation that's taking place.
Well, that's part of what I want to pick up on, because Revolutionary Wealth, on one front, it strikes me as a very optimistic book. But it's also pointing out that American society in particular has a number of challenges in a sense, catching up with its own present, let alone getting into the future. And let me divide that, if I could, for a minute, into two different components here. The first is your optimism. I mean, there's at a time when lots of people are worried and we have right track, wrong track numbers and all that. And you know, it strikes me that you are, in the long run, profoundly optimistic both about America, but also about the human race. And can you share a little bit of that optimism?
Well, first of all, its source is I'm an American, which means I think that we're chemically optimistic to begin with. And I believe that you now have more people on the planet who are educated, who want to make change, who are from every different culture and every different country. It's not just Americans, who have the capabilities that we have more capability than previous generations ever had. We also have access to more knowledge than any previous generation ever had. And we have, so I think we have more tools to work with in making change. And I think that we need to learn, if we haven't, that you can't change technology without changing institutions. And institutions, you can't change those without changing culture and music and art and all kinds of other things. We're living in a system. And the argument we make in Revolutionary Wealth is that the U.S. right now, at this moment of history, is not just spearheading technology. We're spearheading a new way of life, a new civilization. Just as the Industrial Revolution created a new civilization, different from an agrarian civilization where most people are peasants and uneducated and so on. Very different, a new way of life, but that we haven't made the institutional changes required. When I talk about institutions, I'm talking about everything from family life to the Department of Homeland Security, to any of the big government agencies, to major corporations. We're still organized, physically, structurally organized, to operate effectively in a mass production industrial age system in which massification, mass production, mass media, mass education, mass sports, mass this, mass that, mass the other thing, was still the primary underlying impetus or force in the industrial age. The factory assembly lines were based on the idea of mass production. And what has been happening over the past 20, 30 years are technologies that permit us to cheaply diversify products to more and more, and niche marketing and niche this and niche that and niche the other thing. So our society as a whole is becoming more internally diverse, and many of the institutions, two things. We're becoming more internally diverse and we're moving faster, okay? Mm-hmm. Our institutions are not necessarily moving faster. Many of them aren't moving perceptibly. And the other aspect of this is change is accelerating, but different American institutions, from family life to schools to the way we deal with parenting and all these ways of life and institutions are changing at different speeds. And so we have a problem in America that we in Revolutionary Wealth call desynchronization. So business is changing at 100 miles an hour, let's say. There's a cop with a radar gun measuring these cars going by. Each one represents an institution. So there comes this car just racketing down the highway. That's business. It's changing rapidly because it's under tremendous competitive pressure. You don't change, you die. Okay. The next car that's coming along is filled with people who symbolize NGOs, non-governmental organizations, volunteer organizations, associations of one kind. They're not profit-making, and they're also not. They are non-governmental, non-business, and so on. And that group, or that growth of civil society, that's exploding right now. Organizations are cropping up at every level: local, national, global. And these organizations have enormous and increasing power to influence everything from genetically modified foods to political decisions that are being made. And that car's going at 90 miles an hour. It's changing very rapidly. But you work your way down, look at institution after institution, you finally take a look at one car that's coming down the highway. It's chugging along. It's got steam coming out of the engine, and it's got a couple of flat tires, and it's bumping along, and it's changing at maybe 10 miles an hour, and that's called public education. Our schools were not designed to handle the speed, to prepare young people for the speed and complexity of the life they're going to have to live.
And you could argue that if you look at Congress and its state legislatures, they're at 1 mile an hour.
Yeah, we do say that further on in the book.
So in a sense, I can't do this graphically very well, but in a sense, if people could see these multiple cars coming down the road, part of the challenge you have as a citizen is, at one level as a consumer, you're getting this dramatic scale of change. At a different level as a citizen, you're getting not very much change at all. And so isn't inherently the tension going to increase between the desynchronization as it develops? Don't you inherently have more and more tension between institutions and bureaucracies that can avoid change and institutions that find themselves compelled to change?
Well, absolutely, and that's why, I mean, you say that we are optimistic in this book, and we are, but only if we recognize the problems the challenges that we face and do something about them. I believe, and this is a dramatic statement, that we're going to see a series of institutional Katrinas. And the easiest ones to look at are the government bureaucracies. Now, companies are organized as bureaucracies as well, most of them. But the government has the biggest and best of bureaucracies. So what you have, we're fighting Al Qaeda, which is a scrambled, hidden network, right? And so what do we do to respond to that? We create the Department of Homeland Security. We take 14 or 50 intelligence agencies and put them all together in one bigger bureaucracy. We do that because we know how to do that. We're good at it. We're great at creating bureaucracies. We learned that in 200 years of industrial development. But that is clearly the most inappropriate way you can organize to carry out the goals of that very organization.
Well, and to some extent, aren't you also saying that even within business, because it's not a single car, the most bureaucratic and in some ways the most successful past businesses, to the degree that they are still wedded to this large bureaucratic industrial model, make it harder for them to succeed in the competitive marketplace? So you see a real differentiation in the speed and agility and flexibility even in the business community.
All you have to do is look at General Motors. What's happening to General Motors, which was sort of the symbol of American business organization forms, and everybody read the books about how GM was organized, and we got to do the same thing. And it is hard. Now, I guess one of the implicit messages of revolutionary wealth is that for all the fantastic, wonderful, dramatic changes that have taken place in technology, and the breakthroughs and the developments in all these different fields, that's the easy part. The hard part is institutional change, changing these obsolete megaliths in which most people find themselves working or having to deal with. That these gigantic bureaucracies are going to collapse if we don't change them first. And that's why I believe that we're heading toward an institutional implosion in the United States with, as I suggested a moment ago, we're going to see a Katrina in health systems, in this system, that system, the other system, because the institutions don't work in the new environment.
So in that sense, isn't part of the message of revolutionary wealth that there's this extraordinary future if you in fact solve the institutional problems?
Right.
And the institutional problems are inherently solvable largely through politics. So you almost have to get to a revolutionary wealth political framework in order to then get government to move into.
I think that that's true, but it's not just politics. I mean, it's politics, but in the private sector, you have the same kind of resistance to change, and so I believe the next round, the next generation, is going to be just really bitter battles about restructuring, not just. Bill Gates took a long time before he publicly criticized public education, as far as I know, but then he said of public education. No, the issue is not to reform the system. The issue is to replace the system. Reform is not enough. That the way we are now set up, whether it's the intelligence agencies or whether it's any of the other government agencies, or whether it's the gigantic corporate dinosaurs, we are going to have to radically upset the existing relationships within them. There are going to be tremendous internal fights over whether to do this, how to do this, and so forth. And it's going to be exquisitely painful, but we have to do it.
One of the things I've been saying, remarkably parallel, but it shouldn't surprise you since we've spent so many years talking and pursuing ideas
bouncing
together. Bouncing ideas. But I've been saying to audiences that real change requires real change. And that what you get is large systems that want to issue a press release about change without change. And I've been using a quote from Einstein that I'm sure you're familiar with, that insanity is when you think that by doing more of what you're already doing, you'll get a different result. And I sense when I go around, I make a lot of speeches every week, and when I go around the country, I sense part of what's going to happen with revolutionary wealth is it's going to be an aha moment where people say, that's right, that helps me organize and explain what I've already intuited.
Well, one of the things I think that is really important in revolutionary wealth, and that is we have to change the way we think about the economy. And one of what we try to explain is that what economists and business gurus and financial leaders talk about when they talk about the economy, they're talking about the exchange of money, as though that were the only form of economic activity in society. What we discovered in writing Revolutionary Wealth is that there is an enormous non-money economy in which people create value and has an enormous impact on the money economy, but is hidden, unmeasured. There's no metrics. There's no study of this, almost none, I should say. And that is what we call a prosumer economy. It's an economy in which every American, practically, every human being participates. It's the economy in which you do for yourself what you previously bought in the marketplace. Let's say you want to paint your house. You go to Home Depot or someplace, you buy the paint, and you get some brushes, and you pay for it. That then gets registered by economists as part of the GDP, gross domestic product, which properly should be renamed gross distorted product. And economists know that. But that's part of the economy. Now you go home and you paint your house. And it looks much better, it makes you happier, it improves the neighborhood and all the rest of that. That is not in any way, that improvement is not reflected in any way in our economic data, in our understanding of what we do. Or you go to the
Let me say that for a second. Whereas by contrast, if you had hired somebody to come and paint the house, that would have counted as an economic activity.
That's right. Even if the painter you hired were less good than you, that would be economic. Even though the outcome is the same, but it's done by somebody for themselves or for someone else without pay. We do a lot of things without pay that have a big impact on the economy. Take the most powerful example currently is Linux. Here's a guy, young Finn, sitting in Finland. I mean, that's as far from America's awareness as you can get as far as countries are concerned. There's little Finland up there, right? Of course, there's Nokia and a variety of other companies there. But he's sitting there unhappy with the software that he's been given on his job. And he says, I think I could do better than that. And so off the job, unpaid, as a hobby, he begins to write an alternative operating system for computers. And he says, when he has it, this is better than what we've got. And he puts it on the web. And thousands of programmers look at that on the web and say, hey, it'll be better if I add this and I add that. And they're all adding pieces to it, all of them without pay, without money. And the result of that is open source software that has Microsoft trembling in its boots. It's called Linux, and China says all government agencies from now on will use Linux. And that'll also give the finger to the United States and Microsoft and so forth. And so one guy volunteering and then other volunteers doing unpaid work can shake the system. And we do not understand yet all the things that are going on outside the formal economy, outside the money economy, that have a big impact on the money economy.
So in a sense, if you could capture the totality, you'd have a much wealthier civilization than we currently technically report to ourselves.
The only number that's been suggested, and I don't know how good it is that we would have an economy twice the size that it is now. That we create as much value outside the money system with an effect on the money system than the money system itself in the United States.
We're going to have to take a brief break to look at some other things and then come back to pick up with revolutionary wealth and the notion, as you just said, that we may actually be twice as wealthy as we actually currently record as an example of genuinely revolutionary wealth.
Exactly.
So we'll be back in just a minute.
Afterwards, and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with Alvin Toffler and Newt Gingrich in a moment.
Mark Bowden, Atlantic Monthly national correspondent and author of the internationally acclaimed books Killing Pablo and Black Hawk Down, is live on Book TV's In Depth this Sunday beginning at noon. Mr. Bowden discusses how the fanaticism of the 1980s Iranian hostage takers could easily apply to members of Al-Qaeda and other Muslim terrorist groups. From his latest book, Guests of the Ayatollah. Join our live 3-hour discussion this Sunday at noon Eastern as Book TV's In Depth welcomes Mark Bowden on C-SPAN 2.
It's really sinful, shameful, sad, reprehensible in this day and age.
Sunday night at 8 on C-SPAN's Q&A, United Nations World Food Program Executive Director James Morris on the impact of hunger in our world.
Just imagine if the headline in the Washington Post tomorrow morning said 45 747 airplanes crashed today, all full of children, and everyone was killed. And oh, by the way, that's likely to be the situation for the foreseeable future.
James Morris is Sunday night's guest on C-SPAN's Q&A. You can listen to Q&A on C-SPAN Radio, on XM and Sirius Satellite Radio. It's also online as a C-SPAN podcast.
Afterwards with Alvin Toffler and Newt Gingrich continues.
Al, before we get back to revolutionary wealth and the important book that you and Heidi have developed, I think it'll help the folks watching us to understand the range that you and Heidi bring to thinking about this. If you could take us back to, as you once described yourself to me, a boy from Brooklyn and a girl from the Bronx, and how you all met in the early phases of your being together, I just think it'll give people a sense of the richness that underlies revolutionary wealth as a book.
Well, I'm almost embarrassed to talk about how we met because it's so corny. It's so old Hollywood style. I was, in 1948, a volunteer in North Carolina registering black voters in advance of the election. And I was traveling with some black friends and knocking at doors and trying to get people registered. But being 19 years old, I discovered that I had dirty laundry, and the only thing you do when you're a boy, 19 years old in those years, to get clean laundry is you give it to mom. So that decided me I have to go back for a weekend, back to New York, and drop the laundry off. And by the way, while I'm there, go back to NYU, New York University, and to Washington Square and see my pals. And that's what I did. So I went to... for those who don't know, Washington Square is essentially the campus for New York University. And as I walked across the park, I saw at some distance a girl who was in one of my classes, and sitting next to her was a gorgeous blonde. And I was introduced to Heidi, and we have been inseparable from that day. That night we went to a concert, we heard Wagner, and we palled out, and we went to bookstores together, and we just became one.
But what is always fascinating, I mean, I've watched you and Heidi interact, you know, the energy, the passion, the excitement, the arguments.
Argument, yeah.
I've never seen a couple more with a greater zest for life than you two. But here you have these two kids from New York, if I can put it that way, late 1940s. You two then decide that your future requires a detour into the real world. And could you just, because I think our viewers will be fascinated to see the underlying background to revolutionary wealth is a direct contact with American production systems.
Absolutely.
That makes, you could never have predicted from sitting there at NYU in 1948.
What we did, I was then, as I said, 19 or 20 years old. I knew from age 7 that I wanted to write. That I knew. I was encouraged by role models, my uncle and aunt. It terrified my parents because they thought that would mean lifetime poverty. And in order to write, I thought I needed experience of the real world. And after all, my models were Jack London. He became a sailor, and John Steinbeck picked grapes to find out what reality was about. And so we went to work in factories. And we spent 5 years on assembly lines and doing other kinds of factory labor. Heidi became a shop steward. Heidi helped desegregate the local municipal swimming pool in 1948, for which I bless her even now.
And she did it as a shop. Tell the story for a minute, because there's a context to this event.
She was elected a shop steward in the United Auto Workers. She was working in a foundry, an aluminum foundry. I was working in a steel foundry, and then also on an auto assembly line. Had many, many different jobs during this period. And you learn things. You learn, for example, that when the guy in a white shirt comes along with a clipboard, he's there to figure out how fast he can make the line work and make you work harder. And so you slow down before he comes. And you learn a lot about the internal life of this old industrial system and the mass production system that we all depended on. And then, so we did that for 4 or 5 years, and then decided the time had come for something else. And finally to do some kind of journalistic or writing work. And what kind of job could I get? The first job I got was a job on a magazine devoted to welding. And the editor said, "You're getting this job because you know how to weld, now show me you know how to write." And I had that job briefly, and then got a job on a trade union newspaper, published actually by the Printers Union. And they, after a year or two, and this was a tremendous change for us to go from that world, they sent us to Washington.
But before you get there, I want to go back to Heidi's the shop steward, and you have this moment which leads to the desegregation of the local swimming pool.
Right.
I think the human story of why she did it and how she came into contact with this reality.
In her plant, in her foundry, there were 1,000 workers, roughly half white, half black. And every year there was a picnic. And she was head of the recreation committee of the union. And so they said, "What are we going to do this year?" And she said, "Well, why don't we go swimming in the municipal pool?" And a lot of the black folks said, "We can't, we're not allowed to." And you don't say you're not allowed to my wife. And you don't tell Heidi that something cannot be done. And so she, and certainly not alone, but helped organize and took the entire plant to the swimming pool, at which point, when you had hundreds of people approaching the swimming pool, the segregation sign came down and never went back up.
I wanted to go into the story for a minute for 3 reasons. First of all, I'm extraordinarily fond of you and Heidi, and I think the world needs to know better just what a remarkable person she is and how much she has driven and contributed. Second, it's important to see how much things have changed in the last 50 years. To realize that even in a northern city like Cleveland, there were segregated swimming pools, and it was legally enforced. And third, and so things can change, and they can change very dramatically. And third, to suggest that there's a human framework of this change, that it was a real person who had won a real stewardship job, who made a real decision. And I want to do that to now go back to your prosumer point, because you're describing, as you were describing the Linux story a little while ago, I was also thinking about the rise of the Wikipedia. which is this extraordinary institution that has sort of self-organized and allows people to participate in writing a people's encyclopedia online for real, and apparently, at least based on one study, is not significantly more
accurate,
more inaccurate, I was going to say, than the
Encyclopedia Britannica.
That in studies, highly professional experts make about the same range of mistakes as massive numbers of amateurs cheerfully all piling on. And that, it strikes me as an example of your point of prosumer, of being a prosumer. But as you describe it in Revolutionary Wealth, and this is in a sense a continuing evolution from the third wave, that this wave of change keeps coming through. So it's not just being a prosumer, but that the process of this new revolutionary wealth changes how we relate to each other, how we relate to families, how we relate between generations. And could you expand a little bit on this notion of this pervasive process at a personal level of the kind of changes that you see evolving?
Well, I think that to go back to Future Shock, when we were writing Future Shock, and then bring it forward, when we were writing Future Shock, we went around and asked leading experts on the family, from the Census Bureau to psychologists, psychiatrists, and everybody talk about the family. What's going to happen to the nuclear family? And the answer we got, almost 100%, was nothing is going to happen to it because it is a universal and eternal form. Well, it is not a universal and eternal form, and we thought, how can you have a lot of technological and social change going on in the society and not affect the structure of the family? Well, we now know. We now know that only some 25% of people live in what was officially called the nuclear family then, which was father goes to work, mother stays home, 2 kids under the age of 18 at home. And that, in fact, not only has the family structure changed, but the functions of the family have changed. In the old agrarian society, the family was the school, because there was no school. The family was the doctor. There was no hospital. The family took care of the elderly. There was no pension system. None of these institutions that developed during the industrial age existed. So what you had, the family had powerful, important functions within the society. Industrialism stripped those away. Education went to the school system. Medical care went to the hospital and the doctor, the medical system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty soon there's not a lot left of really important social functions. And all of that has multiplied and changed. And so today, if you look at the family, it's still going through enormous and rapid change. Whether we're looking at gender relationships, sexual relationships, whether we're looking at intergenerational relationships, whether if we're looking at the new formats that are socially approved or socially acceptable, whether it is after a second divorce or a first divorce or third divorce or what have you, and the whole issue about gay marriage and gay civil union. All of these are changing the structure of family life in the society. And I should say that the changes I and Heidi describe here are not just taking place in America. They're taking place wherever this new technology and this transformation is happening. We are the leader. We're spearheading these changes. And what's happening, I believe, is we're living through, in the United States, a very confusing period because we are decadent. We are doing things that are absolutely decadent, like ancient Rome, you know. But at the same time, we're post-decadent. We're inventing new ways of getting along together. We're inventing new relationships, whether they're business relationships or political relationships and so on. And the consequence of that is that we're torn. Many of our values that we learned as kids are now being attacked or are ignored. You have extreme attempts to experiment with new models of things. Some of those are wonderful. Some of those are criminal. Some of those are just psychologically sick. So people are experimenting with all kinds of ways of life that was not likely or possible during a mass production factory style age. We don't know where all of these are going to shake out, but it is a period of incredible rapid and complex change. And I think that the breakdown of institutions has a lot to do with the breakdown of the old value system. and that is every institution, when you set up a church or a business, or you set up a political group, or you set up a bowling group, I mean, whatever it is, every institution reflects the values, or some values, in the community or in the society, and also propagates those values. So if you've got a big company that, you know, that believes in the market economy and believes in this and believes in that and so forth, it not only does that shape the organization, but the organization then sends out those values to the community around it. What's happening is the breakdown of our malfunctioning of our institutions is also leading to the breakdown of our value system that they have been promoting over generations. And so we are caught in a period of high uncertainty. People don't know what to believe and what to think and what to value and what not to value. And in that, there is this big fight between the religious community and the secular community and so forth and so on. And I believe that that's not going to settle down until we begin to create new kinds of institutions to replace these obsolete institutions, whether it's, again, political institutions, government institutions. These bureaucracies have to come down, and we have to be replaced.
But in your model, which comes first, the redefinition of the values, and then the institution grows around
Well,
them?
it's feedback.
Or is it a parallel at the same time?
Yeah, that's at the same time. They're feeding each other. One of the things that I think marks the work that Heidi and I have tried to do over these decades is to show that you can't have technology without changes in culture, society, values, and every other dimension of life. And you can't have changes in the value system without affecting technology and how you construct politics and business. It's interrelated. So while in our work we deal with everything from family life to Hollywood to science to this to that to the other thing, our purpose is to synthesize all of that and to make it possible for an individual reading this to see how he or she fits within this larger picture of change and what contribution he or she is making, not just to the emergence of a new America, but in fact a new way of life or civilization that's we are spreading around the world.
I was going to say, I mean, part of what I'm struck with Revolutionary Wealth and with your earlier works is that your impact hasn't just been in the U.S. In fact, in some ways, it's been even more powerful in Japan or in Korea or in China. Could you talk for a minute about your experiences? I know you've traveled a lot, and you make presentations all over the world. What's your sense of relative receptivity to these kind of ideas and to the way in which the concepts of revolutionary wealth will be received?
I think we have a pretty good idea that our work has been received most enthusiastically and in a most practical way in terms of actually making change in Asia. It has been less valued in Europe. And of course it has had big impacts in the United States where in which most of the stories and information reflects. In China, in 1983, there was a conference in October of 83, a conference in Beijing, in the the communist government under rigid communist economics. And the then prime minister said, we must study the third wave. And people were afraid. And so they went to the chairman of the Communist Party at that time and said, what do you think of what the prime minister said? And he said words to the effect of, too many people in the Communist Party are afraid of new ideas. And so they then published apparently millions of copies of the third wave as a tool to reform, to begin to break down the communist rigidity of the system. And we didn't know about that until 2 years after it happened, when we were flying to Paris, and I read L'Express magazine in French and said the second best-selling book in China after the speeches of Deng Xiaoping was The Third Wave by Alvin Toffler, and we fell into our airplane seats and said, how come? But in fact, that was how come. We had previously been to China, and Heidi had brought with her, we brought not only a third wave, but we brought a video cassette of a documentary based on the third wave that Heidi had produced or helped produce. And that, I said, Heidi, we've got too much baggage, don't bother taking it, they won't show it. She said, don't be an idiot, they'll see it at the top. And that is apparently what happened. So we had,
But now your own experience also reinforces one of the concerns some Americans have about dealing with China, because in effect the net royalty from being the #2 seller in China was what?
Zero. Called intellectual property theft.
Yeah.
But the irony of this is that that was the greatest theft of our intellectual property, but also one of the most influential impacts that we've had.
That's right. There's probably a swap you were willing to make at
Yeah,
that point.
At that point, I certainly, yeah.
So I can't help but carry you a stage further because you've always been very skeptical of those who assume that we should be afraid of China, that China is inevitably going to accomplish things in ways that are miraculous, and yet you have a great love for the Chinese and you have a great interest in China. Walk our audience for just a minute. I don't want to steal this from Revolutionary Wealth, but I think it's so interesting. Walk them through your notion of some of the patterns as you think about China and where it might lead to.
Well, when you have changes on the order of the Industrial Revolution or the rise of a third wave, as we call it, a third wave of change, you have conflict in the society. Under the old Marxist analysis of China, you could see that you have, first of all, there are like 80,000 or 84,000 violent protests in China every year now, according to their own Chinese police statistics. And who knows how many are not counted and how violent they may be. The country is bubbling with change, good changes, bad changes, and it's just undergoing fantastic upheaval. So, first of all, the idea that China is going to automatically continue on a straight line growth toward superpowerdom, I don't buy. Nothing continues in a straight line. And when you try to change reality and bring a billion people out of poverty in 20 years or 30 years, it's not going to be like this. We think it's going to be like that, okay? But in the old system, the Marxists would look at that and say, there's a class struggle between the poor and the rich. And we say, that's too simple. There's a struggle between those who have interests in the agrarian economy, those who have interests in the industrial economy, and those who have emerging interests in the high-tech new third wave part of the economy. So you have all three, and each of these economies has a different way of life that comes with it. Agriculture, living in a peasant village is one way of life. Living an urban life is another. And living with a computer and a cell phone and an iPod and all the rest hitched to your belt, that's another way of life. And so you have three competing ways of life in China at the moment. And so the old leadership, the Communist Party leadership, worried about an upheaval, a revolution. What they worried about was a worker-peasant coalition. First of all, they tried to create a worker-peasant coalition to overthrow the old nationalist government that preceded communism. But then they continued to worry within. And there's a big debate in China about what they called city-first policies. What would happen, and this was true of Stalin and Russia, and it was true in China under the communist regime, what they did was impoverish the peasants by not letting them sell their product to anybody but the state. The state then bought the food at deep discount, in effect, cheap, cheap, cheap. They kept the peasants poor. They took the gain and used that to build infrastructure, to modernize, to build factories. So they squeezed the countryside for the benefit of industrialization, okay? And that was a known policy. And now, so the idea was the peasants and workers had, in that case, different interests. What they're always afraid of, just as Lenin tried to put together and failed, a worker-peasant revolution, the Chinese, Mao Zedong, tried to do that. Could never organize the peasants. He organized the peasants, could never organize the workers to go with them. What we think is more likely is if there is an upheaval in China, and I'm not saying there will be, but if there is an upheaval, and there's a perfectly good likelihood that possible, given the rates of change and the upset in life, then it may come from a completely different source. And I don't want to give away the punchline, so to speak. But
So folks should read Revolutionary Wealth to understand the...
read the chapter about China. I think it has a surprise ending, so to speak. But if we look around the world, China is, of course, developing most rapidly in this direction. Europe is amazingly slow to adapt and adopt the new technologies. You have great scientific brain power in Europe. You have Nokia, you have pockets of advanced technology in Ireland and Finland and even in Slovakia a little bit. But Germany, France remain recalcitrant. There is something technophobic. The Asians love technology. It's delicious. They see that as the path to a good life. The Europeans have a completely different view of technology. They're very suspicious of it. And maybe some of that is because of the uses to which technology was put by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. So one can perhaps understand it. But the fact is that in 2000, the leaders of Europe met in Lisbon. I happened to be in Portugal at the time, not at the meeting, but there. And they said, by 2010, we're going to become the world's most advanced, most successful, knowledge-based economy. Then, year after year, the EU agencies would issue reports. 2001, nada, nothing. 2002, no change. 2003, every year their reports show nothing has happened. At which point, one of the leading French writers said, but Europe is the world's greatest industrial power today. And he's right. The problem is the U.S. is the world's greatest no longer industrial power. And the Europeans are having a hard time accepting that.
Let me ask you one other thing, totally off this. Thinking about the extraordinary life you and Heidi have led and how far you've come from where your parents were afraid you'd end up, how many things you've done, how many countries you visited. We're going to have some viewers watching us who are fairly young, and not just what does Revolutionary Wealth as a book mean to them, but if you were their Dutch uncle giving them advice, what are the lessons as you look back over this extraordinary life you've led and the contribution you've made? What principles would you suggest to them to guide their lives?
Well, first, obviously, everybody's different and therefore needs different advice, but all I can say is what we have tried. We've welcomed a diverse life. The idea of going into a business magazine and learning about organization theory and how big companies operate after having worked in a factory, after having done other things in journalism and so forth, we've welcomed that. So the more diversity we could get, the more we could learn. And indeed, that's true of our reading, for example. I'm reading 6 or 8 books at the same time. And I like that because in Book A, I'm reading maybe about the history of the religion and the Enlightenment. In Book 2, it may be something totally, I'm reading about Google. I'm reading about something totally different. And when you read in totally different categories, simultaneously, you begin to see links and relationships that you wouldn't otherwise imagine. And so it stirs new thinking to the diversity. We read a lot. I'm a reading machine. I read the New York Times every day. I read the Financial Times every day. I read not the Wall Street Journal, I read the Los Angeles Times every day. And best of all, I read the Daily Yomiuri. No American knows practically never about the Daily Yomiuri. Yomiuri is the biggest paper in Japan. Its circulation dwarfs that of the combined circulation of New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, put them all together. 10 million copies a day go out of Yomiuri. And because it's a national paper, not just a local paper. And they put out an English edition. And that English edition is wonderful because not only does it have a lot of news about Japan and Asia, but it always has a few pages from the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, so the London Times, and so forth and so on. So you get a world picture, part of a world picture, by reading the Daily Yomiuri in English. And since our column is carried in the Daily Yomiuri, they send us this, and we read it every day.
That's great. That's wonderful. Well,
so it's a diversity to try to diversify the sources of your information and the diverse life experiences.
Okay. So we are in this particular show trying to convince people that they should both read Revolutionary Wealth and sign up for the Daily Yomiuri.
Oh, Yomiuri will love this program.
Well, Japan is not a small place. But anyway, I just want to say on behalf of C-SPAN, I've never done this before. I can't imagine a time I'd rather do it than to be the interviewer for a very dear personal friend and somebody who I think has made an enormous contribution to America. And I wish you all the luck on the book tour with Revolutionary Wealth and every opportunity to continue developing new ideas and new approaches. And I hope you and Heidi have a wonderful year doing this.
And you and I can continue to argue about politics all night long.
I am confident.